things by my count. And in one of several of them, I'm going to probably be talking about the products that we do around here. Namely, in addition to all sorts of other stuff in VMware Tanzu land, we've got several Kubernetes distributions. And, I am not someone who can remember big feature sheets for stuff. So I always like to go and refresh what's in each one. Because it's one thing to memorize, when you come to various tiers of a product, like the general outcome, the benefits, the purpose of each thing, right? But it's nice to know a little bit about the exactitudes of what's in there. So I thought what I'd do today for our Tanzu talk here is just you can join me as I remember and sometimes just learn to remember what exactly is going on with our various Kubernetes packagings and distributions. So first, let's open up. If you go to, thankfully, we have this sort of page up here where you can see, across our packagings of Kubernetes distributions. And I guess I should say what these additions are is they start with just a baseline of Kubernetes at the bottom, right? And then what you're adding on top of that are all the various services that you need from an operational standpoint, then a developer standpoint, and then even security and compliance, if you think of those things differently. And to a certain extent, enterprise architecture, you could label it as that, but they layer on these additional features. And this is something that it took me several years to figure out. And I think it takes lots of people some time to figure out that's worth saying over and over again, is that Kubernetes itself is actually a very small component of all of this. It's actually doesn't do as much as you probably think it does. It's not a hardware store that has every single thing you want. It's instead, like, as people like to say, a collection of, what do they call it? Atomic units. It's basically just like a way of getting containers, setting them up on nodes, making sure your networking can talk to each other, and having some basic architecture of the life cycle of the containers, the life cycle of the pods, collections of containers, putting them together in a a namespace, if you will, kind of like a city block, if you will. And there's always new projects that become part of Kubernetes, or more importantly, are ancillary things, add-ons, plugins, whatever you want to call them to Kubernetes, to add things like managing multiple clusters, making it easier to set up multiple containers and multiple pods, so big complicated systems you're deploying. And definitely when it comes to a lot of the benefits, to use the phrase that you get from GitOps, which is just a fancy way of saying that we are doing a lot of the DevOps streams of doing configuration led things, where we configure what our application wants to look like. We describe it, and then we kind of give it off to the cloud system, to the build pipeline to deploy it. And it gets us to that point where we can do really fast deploys. And also further down the road, because you're not directly setting up, packaging up your applications to run, and you're not kind of worrying about the security, the networking configurations, you get a lot of benefits for standardizing and enforcing security and things like that. Anyways, that whole part of everything that comes before you have a container, and even like the configuration of how the container fits, the YAML files for I forget what they call it nowadays, the configuration map or whatever. I don't know. The terms have changed recently, enough over the years that I lose track. But there's basically a description of, like, I'm going to give you Kubernetes, all these containers, and here's the way I want you to configure them, and how I want you to, configure them. What would you call it? The topology, using all these vague terms, but basically the blueprint of how you want it deployed over your infrastructure. Getting to that point takes a whole other set of tools, and your typical build pipeline to go from an idea to code to building up the containers. That's a whole other separate thing that's not part of Kubernetes. So having it all integrated and working together is basically what all the distros are doing out there, right? I mean, the basic thing, as we call it here, is having a registry that containers go in, having it work in the first place, right? So that's a big part of Kubernetes, is having it work on your network and with whatever kind of thing you have. And so that basic getting up to, people call it a dial tone. I like to think of it as a blinking cursor, but getting to that dial tone of Kubernetes, getting to that point where Kubernetes is ready to be used. You're ready to deploy something to it in an acceptable enterprise way, right? Getting it working is what the basic tier does, right? And you can come to one of our fancy diagrams of that, right? Where we this is actually a pretty good summary once you kind of have a loose handle on it, is basically it allows you to run Kubernetes in vSphere, which is fine. Everyone has vSphere. So you can start to run it on premise and mess around with it. So if you have some developers who want to be using Kubernetes, chances are you can just set it up for them and let them go to town. And at the same time, don't tell them you're doing this as an operations person or an enterprise architect, but you're making sure that they're sandboxed. They're contained in this environment that you may not want to, worry about controlling now, but you will have a path to doing all those things developers are fiddly about, like long-term support of it, making sure it follows the compliance and security things you want, even making sure you're following enterprise architecture. And a lot of people who talk about using Kubernetes, they don't necessarily face these problems where in large organizations you have thousands and thousands of applications over 10 to 20 years. And a lot of what you suffer from is that you didn't contain and you didn't guide and shepherd the various architectures and stacks people are using. So now you have this huge amount of architectural tech debt where there's all sorts of stuff that you have to manage, and you're spending all your time on that variability on this weird stack over here someone did, on this slightly other stack of infrastructure and development tools someone had. What often happens here is you have multiple versions of a Java runtime or a web app runtime, or multiple vendors that you're buying your basic, infrastructure from. And that just becomes a nightmare to manage. And, I'm a developer, so I was a developer. Now as one of my friends used to say, I used to be good at my job and now I'm good at this. But developers just they don't care. That's just nothing that developers' long-term supportability fitting into thousands of applications. It's never really been something that's their concern. And that is why in larger organizations, you actually need, whether you want to call it this nowadays, you actually need enterprise architecture and kind of enterprise operations thinking to make sure that, again, literally in 10 years, this application isn't going to be the thing that pulls down and kind of calcifies your IT department. So anyhow, if you start with that kind of structure for people using Kubernetes, you're containing them in that sandbox. Now, as we go over with standard, essentially to summarize, this is when you've gone beyond those initial usages and you want multiple groups, multiple lines of business if you're organized that way, but multiple developer groups who are using the same standardized Kubernetes setup. I would even think of it as the infrastructure that your developers are using. You're trying to set up this self-service way that they can get infrastructure and worry about application development, moving pixels on the screen. So that's a lot of what comes in standard, essentially. We would call it multi-cloud. Whether you want to run on-premise, you want to run using public cloud. And again, it's not whether you want to do this, you're doing this at, all at once. And then also equally, valuable is when you want to run on, this is whatever term. I'm rolling my eyes because a lot of people latch on to terms like these, and because they are used as a descriptive mainstream way, they kind of attack them as meaningless and not useful. So I'm not actually saying the term is bad. I'm saying that people getting upset at it is kind of bad. You have to have terms. Otherwise, we don't have a shared language. We don't know what we're talking about. And that term is edge computing. Now, that can mean a whole lot of different things in the different context you're in. Always find out first if you're talking about virtual desktops. That's always a whole other separate concern. But if you're talking about the world of Kubernetes and infrastructure, all that edge means, and this is my belief, is edge means a smaller, non-centralized install of Kubernetes or whatever than your other stuff. So this could be running in a warehouse. It could be running in a store. Early on, there was an example of Chick-fil-A starting up Kubernetes that built the stack on their own that ran in each store. I don't know if they still do that, but it would monitor the temperature of things and their oil, they fry their lovely waffle fries in. So these are all edge computing things, right? It doesn't run in public cloud. It doesn't run in your centralized data center, which can also be spread out everywhere. But it's just a smaller install running somewhere else. So you could manage all of these multiple clouds with the standard edition instead of just one. And so you see that in our comparison here, right? You still get, of course, it's the layering thing essentially. But you see, you also get a lot of more of the, management things that you need to run it and manage it in production. You've got more of a centralized policy things, all the stuff you would expect from enterprise grade along there. And then let's also look. So then the final one, before you get to the enterprise thing, is the advanced edition. Now, this is like the current one that we have now. I forget when we launched it. I think it was December, whatever. But it's the one that if you talk to a Tanzu person, this is the one that we're always trying to drive you towards and suggest is a good idea. And this one adds in, let me see which diagram I got here. But this one is what I was kind of alluding to earlier, where you have these use cases, these capabilities, these outcomes that you're targeting for, right? So you not only have the lower stack of doing multi-cloud running Kubernetes and adding in, people call it observability now, whatever, your systems management stuff of like monitoring and log management, doing root cause analysis, trying to get insights, as we used to call it, and application tracking. So you can find out what's going wrong, but also people forget about this with systems management. You can know that everything's fine, right? That's actually arguably much more valuable than knowing when things are wrong, because things are going to be fine more than they're going to be wrong. So you should know when you don't need to be freaking out about stuff because everything's cool. Of course, fixing stuff is darn cool as well. But what Advanced is doing is adding in more of these use cases of like, so now when I want to go beyond that dial tone, that blinking cursor, I need to worry about, as we would say in this post-SolarWinds ransomware era, my software supply chain, the secure software supply chain. So I add in lots of the, and this is where like I don't know the exact logos and things that are in there, which is unfortunate for me. I guess I should learn those. Whatever. But it adds in that pipeline before you even get to Kubernetes of managing up how things are packaged, managing the registries, which I guess was in standard as well, but really paying attention to what happens before you even deploy something into Kubernetes and adding policy and security. And also, let's not forget, making it easy for developers to do things. And then all sorts of stuff. Again, it's layering on top, managing is the code in the containers, the actual workloads, the applications I'm running. Is that cool? Is that stuff good? And also what we've been adding in over time, as you can see, we've been layering in also a bunch of what we would call developer frameworks. Now that adds in a service mesh. Now this is a very evolving and again, definitionally complicated and fun area nowadays. The difference between a service mesh and an API gateway. If you remember, we talked with Chris Sterling several episodes ago, kind of distinguishing between, I don't know, an API gateway being more, I don't know my layers, layer 7 stuff versus service meshes being layers 6.5 or, whatever. I'm making this up. But a service mesh is a much more lower level way at the moment of worrying about managing your network stuff versus if you want to put network management closer to the application layer than you have there. And then you add in, all sorts of like monitoring stuff that you would expect operations people need. But on the developer thing, you're also adding things like, I believe Tanzu SQL is a Postgres one, but you're adding in a database. Most developers need a database, and it's nice to have a service in there that makes the database ready to use. You got the application catalog, which is essentially, we acquired Bitnami a while ago. It allows you to set up a whole sort of like, here's all the things, the containers you can use, and lots of Spring things as well integrated. So if you get advanced, you really do have everything from that dial tone to managing across multiple sites. Remember public cloud, private cloud, edge, where we have a fine, nice definition of what edge means. But then you also add in stuff developers use, so you can go beyond that blinking cursor. So there you go. If you want to find out more about that, now I feel refreshed. I think I know well enough what all that stuff is. But if you want to find out more, you can go to VMware. Tanzu.com. No, that's not right. We probably do have that domain name, but you can go to tanzu.vmware.com and just, if you go to products, you can select whichever one you want. And there is somewhere there, you can see the URL up here, but you can kind of compare them and check them out. So with that, I have to get on to my busy day and all the fun stuff that I want to do. If you want to find the show notes for this and all the archives, kind of like that Chris Sterling interview where we talk about the difference between a service mesh and a gateway, all you have to do is go to tanzutalk.com. There's a videos link. It'll be up there. and you can click on that to go see the archives. And you can get a copy of my 3 books for free, going over the meatware stuff. If I just talked about doing things beyond the blinking cursor, those books deal with doing things beyond the development. It's how you set up the culture and the way that you're running your organization. But just go to tanzutalk.com/videos and check that out. And with that, we'll see everyone next